To God be the glory.
Yom Tov Talmudim. Good day, students. This is your instructor, Dr. Dennis Petrello, and we're ready to begin lesson number 3 in Biblical Hebrew. Now, I want to go back just briefly and talk about some of the things that we previewed or we discussed in the earlier lessons. Now, I want to reiterate, before we go on, make sure that by now that you do have the Hebrew alphabet down pretty well and you're able to, without looking at anything, be able to say all of the alphabet, and that you're able to recognize its letters. Now, going to the chalkboard, I want to remind you of some things that we talked about before. And that is these 6 letters called Begad Kafat. That's our little way of reminding ourselves about these particular letters. Base, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Tav. Now, all of these letters, what's unique about the Begad Kafat letters? They can all take a dagesh or a dot. And normally the dot changes the pronunciation, and the dot makes it a harder sound than without the dot. But for our purposes, we're only emphasizing 2 of these 6 letters that are going to change the pronunciation. The bet, that has a definite B sound when it has the dagesh in it. And then when the bet does not have a dagesh, it has a V sound. You say, well, we already have a V sound, and that is with the Vav, the Hebrew letter Vav. This is true, and for all practical purposes, the Vav and the bet without the dagesh, the vet, will be pronounced the same. And so that will be 2 letters that are, although different, will be pronounced the same. And then we have the Pei. When this particular letter has the dagesh or the dot in it, it has a P sound, and without it has a F sound, an F sound. All right, Begad Kafat letters. Remember those particular letters. Now, when these letters occur at the beginning of a word, they always have the dagesh. All right, and that's going to be one thing that will help you remember that. All right, now, going to this side of the board, we also were talking about 5 different Hebrew letters that all take a different form when they occur at the end of a word. Now, remember that, at the end of a word, in the beginning or the middle of the word, the Kaf, the Mem, the Nun, the Pei, and the Sadi all look like this. But when they occur at the end of a word, then they take on what's called an ending form. All right, so the Kaf looks like that. It's kind of squared off on top, and it has a line that extends below the line on the paper. The Mem, which looks like this, now becomes a box-looking letter, writing above the line. The third letter that has a different form at the end is the Nun, which looks like that, almost a straight line that extends below the line on the paper. Now that's going to be very important that you remember that this extended below the line, because if it didn't extend below the line, let's say it looked like that, then we have a different Hebrew letter. That's a Vav. That's a Nun. That's a Vav if it just quit right there. So please remember to distinguish between those 2. The Pei, when it ends a word, it extends below the line like that. And then the Sadi looks like a backward Y, and it also has a line that extends below the line on the paper. All right, now let's go and talk a little bit about lesson number 3 in our textbook, Menahem Mansour's Biblical Hebrew. I want to emphasize and spend a little time looking at the phonetic value of certain consonants. Now, if you're looking on pages 18 and 19 in your textbook, you'll see that he does not have all of the Hebrew letters in there. These are just 15 of the 22 letters that he's going to talk about pronunciation. The first of which you see is the Aleph. He says the Aleph is a glottal stop, as in the initial sound of apple. And we're simplifying this somewhat for our purposes, in that we're going to say that the Aleph does not have any sound whatsoever. But for your information, if you're wondering the way a modern Jew or Hebrew would try to pronounce this particular letter, It would have to do with the breathing and the way that he breathes. And because we do not speak the language as often or as well as they, we do not even make this particular sound at all, and it's not that important for our purposes. However, if you're wanting to proceed, eventually you would learn to make a slight distinction between the aleph, a sound of the aleph, like in the word apple. We have that kind of right there at the beginning, and that's similar to the way the aleph would be pronounced in modern Hebrew. And then the next is the word, or the letter bet. We've already talked about this, and so by way of review, we know that the bet with the dot, or the dagesh, has a definite b sound, b. Without the dot, it's a v sound. The third letter that you look at is what's called the gimel. The gimel with the dot or without it is going to be a G, like in the word go. Go. That's the gimel and the way the gimel sounds. The next letter is the dalet. The dalet, with or without the dot, is going to have a definite D sound. D, as in day. That's the way the dalet will sound in English. The next letter is the Hebrew word hey. This is an H sound. Hey. Hey sound. As in him. That's the way that letter would sound in English. And then the next letter is the vav. The vav has a V sound in modern Hebrew. In biblical Hebrew, and this is where the debate rages on whether it had that W sound or whether it had a V sound. And for our purposes, we're saying the vav will have a V sound. All right? And then the heth sound, he says it has a pharyngeal or a guttural sound. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier, and this is one of the letters that's fun to pronounce in Hebrew, but you got to make sure that you don't spit all over your paper when you try to pronounce it. But it's transliterated an H with a dot underneath it. But it has a definite, that's to distinguish, it has a dot underneath it to distinguish it from the hey. So we're trying to understand when we're transliterating the difference between the two H's. But the H with a dot means we're looking at a hard H sound, and it has a sound like the modern KH, or in the Loch Ness Monster, that k at the end. That's how you pronounce the Hebrew heth. And so it's going to take a little bit of practice, and you'll need to work on this, but it is one that heth, like that. And that's the way that you'll pronounce this word, and as we begin to start reading some of the Hebrew words, you'll pick up on this fairly easily. Now the next one is the mem. The mem the tet. I was looking at that and working at the wrong letter, but tet is a definite T sound, and it's produced by placing the tongue firmly against the palate and transliterated t, like time or something along that line would be how the tet would be pronounced. All right, and then the kaf is another letter that also is one of our begad kafat letters. It can take the dagesh, but it has a K sound. And that K is similar to the lach, like that, but we're softening it enough where it sounds like Kathy or something like that in English. All right, and then the next letter is on top of page 19 in your textbook is the ayin. This again is a pharyngeal or guttural sound. It's produced in the back of the throat and transcribed with the rough breathing. It is very difficult, our textbook reminds us, for Europeans to pronounce it without much practice, because this particular sound does not exist in any European languages. And once again, it's like a glottal stop. It's a cutting off of the breath, or it's an influencing of the breath, and we're not accustomed to that sort of thing, and so it's one that we don't worry about for our own pronunciation. The next letter is the pei. Pei with the dot has a definite P, and without the dot, or the dagesh, has a definite F sound. And then sadi is the next. This is an emphatic S sound, and our textbook tells us that it's kind of like a TS, as in the word fits. And it's easier for me to explain this like a TZ sound. And that's the way it's going to sound, like a TZ. But Fitz, TS, and we understand that sound. That's what the Saudi is going to sound like, is a TZ. The next is the letter Kof. This is a letter that looks like the P in the English alphabet. This was originally a K sound, but produced in the back of the throat. It's transliterated with a Q. Whenever you see a Q in Hebrew transliteration, we know that we're talking about the Kof. And this is pronounced an awful lot like the Kaf. So the Kaf and the Kof have pronunciation very much the same, but this has a K sound, such as in the word queen, or in the word Baroque. That's the K sound that we have from the Hebrew letter Kof. All right, then the Sheen. The Sheen with the dot over the left hand is one that has an S sound to it, and on the right has an SH sound. When you look at this particular letter, you can see that it's written like a W. When it has the dot over here, then it has the SH sound, such as in the English word sherry. But if we take the dot off and it's on the left side like this, then it has just a simple S, like in Abraham's wife, Sarah. Now there's an interesting story that goes along with this particular letter, the Sheen. It's found in Judges chapter 12. Now in a few chapters earlier, you know that Gideon had a little trouble with some of his own people, the Ephraimites. Well, later on, after Jephthah had secured a significant victory against the enemies, the people from Ephraim also came along, and they were giving him trouble as well. And what is interesting about this is that Jephthah wasn't in the mood to put up with the Ephraimites like Gideon was. And so a bunch of the Ephraimites had tried to escape. They had become fugitives on the other side of the Jordan, and Jephthah had it blocked off so that they could not come across without confronting Jephthah and his men. And so when the Ephraimites would come, and they would ask Jephthah, "Let me cross over." This is in Judges chapter 12. He would say, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And if they would say no, then he would give them one more test to see if they were an Ephraimite. Now let's look especially at this text in Judges chapter 12 and verse 6. Then they would say to him, "Say now Shibboleth." But he said Sibboleth, for he could not pronounce it correctly. Now notice those two words. The first word is different only in that it has the SH sound, Shibboleth. But the Ephraimite, because he came from a little bit different part of Palestine, would not be used to saying the SH. Now that doesn't sound like much of a problem to you and I, because we're used to speaking English and we have both an S and an SH sound. But to those people that had not been used to pronouncing the SH, whenever they said that, all they could say was Sibboleth, which means stream, whereas Shibboleth, interestingly enough, means ear of corn. Now that Shibboleth is the Sheen with the little dot on the right arm of the letter. And the word Sibboleth is not a Sheen, but we're looking at the Samic right there. And so it's kind of interesting when we look at that, and that's what we have up here. The difference between an S and an SH. And a little bit of history out of the Bible in Judges chapter 12 that has to do with this particular letter. All right, now, getting back to the lesson, we talked a little bit about the Sheen. The last letter on page 19 is the letter Tav. With or without the dot, it says the T, but actually we're making a little bit of a distinction between those two. When it has a dot, we're making it a definite T sound, and when it does not have the dot, it's a little bit more like a TH sound, like in the English word think. All right, now on the bottom of page 19, they ask us to distinguish carefully between consonants of similar form. All right, let's go to the chalkboard once again and talk about the distinguishing between these various forms. All right, we'll erase some of these that we've had up here. All right, the first we want to distinguish between the base and the kaf. Now when we do this in our square script, there's going to be some more distinct differences than it's going to be in the printed text, which you'll see in your textbook and also in the Bible. All right, so what we're talking about is these two letters, the base and the kaf, sometimes get a little bit confused. And also the gimel and the noon. When we write it out, you can see that that's fairly distinct. But in the printed text, the gimel and the noon are often confused by students. All right, next is the daleth and the resh. Now you can see that these two letters are very, very close together, especially in the printed text. So they're hard to distinguish between the two. When we write it out, the daleth is just a definite square. The resh has a curvature like that. They're basically the same size letter, but you need to be very careful distinguishing between those two. All right, and then also you need to distinguish between the daleth and the final kaf, which goes like that. Remember I said when we have a line on the page, this extends below, and so make sure when you look at the printed page, you're able to distinguish between those two letters. All right, going on, we need to also be careful to distinguish between the hey and the heth. Now I want you to notice the only difference is that the heth is connected. The hey is not connected on the top left of the letter. All right, so you see the difference? This is the heth, this is the hey. And so it's with practice, you'll be able to distinguish between those two letters. All right, and then next is between the vav and the zayin. Now, when we write it out, we can see that the zayin is quite a bit different than the vav. But in the printed text, they barely give you anything on top like that. And so it becomes rather difficult, and both of these are going to sit on top of the line like that. When we write it out, we're going to make the zayin a little bit more extreme, and so we won't have as much trouble. But in the printed text, there is some difficulty with those two. And then the next is the tet and the mem. Once again, when we write these letters out, we can see that there is a definite difference between the two. But in the printed text, they look very, very similar. And if you look in your book there on page 19, you can see that they are quite similar. All right, and that gives you a pretty good idea of some of the things that you need to be careful to distinguish. Let's go on, look at some of the other examples that they have here. I want you to distinguish between the yod. Now let's say this is our line here. The yod just kind of sits up there and floats right there in the middle of nowhere, whereas the vav is one that comes all the way down to the line. All right, but in the printed text, there's not quite that much distinction. Their yod is a little bigger, and you've got to make sure that you have this almost straight line that comes all the way down to the bottom. This is the yod, this is the Hebrew vav. And then also, they've added one more, the distinguishing between the vav and the zayin, which, or excuse me, not the zayin, but the final noon. The final noon is almost exactly like that, but look what it does. See, it goes all the way past the line. So this is the vav, this is the final noon. You say, well, what does a normal noon look like? Well, when it's not the final noon, it comes in. It goes ahead and corners off there on the bottom, whereas this noon comes all the way down. All right? We also need to be careful that we're able to distinguish between the final mem, which we said basically is just a box, and the sadi, which looks like that. But in the printed text, there are some very close similarities between those two, and I've got to admit that that I get stumbled over these two letters on occasion myself, and as we begin reading, I may trip up on these two now and then because they're very, very similar, and as you're trying to read through something fairly quickly, it does get a little bit confusing. And then we need to the ion and the sadi. We also need to be a little bit careful with those two in making sure that we're able to distinguish between those. Now you look at those and say, well, those don't really look all that close to each other. But in actuality, when you start writing and when you look at it in the printed Bibles, you do see that they are quite close to one another. All right, the next examples that they want us to be careful with is the ion and the final sadi, which we've written like that, but still in the printed Bibles they do have some similarities. All right, I think that's probably enough of those. It does also mention the sheen and the seen with the dot on the left arm versus the right arm, and that's something that you also are going to have to work on with a little bit of practice. All right, there are some study hints that we have right there on page 20, the bottom of the page, that first of all, only by constant practice will you be able to pronounce the letters correctly. And learning a language, it's very important to take advantage of verbalizing these things and these words, because it's amazing, especially when we get into the vocabulary, that when you hear a word, sometimes the meaning of that word logs in because you're saying it out aloud. We know that we learn through different ways. We learn both by visual, and we also learn by hearing. And if you can see a word and then hear yourself say the word, then you're a lot better off or more likely to learn what that word means. So pronounce each letter, the book recommends, aloud 5 times. So say Aleph, 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 Aleph. Say it 5 times. Get used to hearing yourself say it. And the letters that are difficult to pronounce are usually the heth, which is a h sound, and then the kaf. You can hear there's a lot of burst of air that comes out with the kaf, and the ayin, which is virtually unpronounced, and we're not going to worry about that because it is very difficult. And then the tz sound of the sadi. Also note the difference between the sheen, the sh, and the seen, the s sound. All right, so study carefully this section on the consonants of similar form, and that will help you. And take any excerpt in Hebrew from any page of this textbook, work on transliterating it. All right, let's go to the exercises now that we have there on page 22, and see if we're able to do some of the things that we've been talking about. All right, distinguish between the following letters by adding the appropriate transliterations. All right, we go up to the top left there, and the first 2 letters that we see, although very similar, we see that we have a hey and heth. All right, hey is transliterated, you'll recall, with an H sound, and the heth with an H and a dot underneath the H, making it a hard sound. And then the next one down, the second one down, is distinguished between a daleth and a resh. Now you see on the printed how very, very close those two are. Very, very close. The only difference is that the daleth squares off and the resh does kind of curve around. And of course the daleth is the English D, the resh is the English R. All right, and then next we have a distinguish between the resh again and between the ending kaf. All right, that's the ending kaf there. See how similar those are? Get used to understanding and seeing that that kaf there on the right has a little bit longer leg to it. All right, then distinguish between the ayin, which has a rough breathing, and the sadi, which is an S or a TZ sound. And then notice these two, how similar they are when they look printed. You have on the left the gimel, which is a definite G sound, and the noon, which is a definite N sound. So, but when you look at it printed, you can see that they're very, very close, and that's something that we kind of stumble over for a while until we get used to noticing the small differences between these two. Might also add that the Hebrew Bible does a better job of making these letters a little bit different. If you get a copy of the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, these letters will be distinguished a little bit better than in our textbook. All right, let's go to the next column over here to the right. We need to also distinguish between the tav and the heth. The tav has a definite T sound, or if without a dagesh, like it has right here, the tav would be th. And then the heth, once again, is the ch sound, like in the word lach. All right, and then you have the ending mem versus the regular mem. And so the one on the left there, the one that's kind of boxed off, is what would look like if you ended a word with that letter. And then the other one is the mem, that is what would happen in the beginning or the middle. All right, and so both of those have the M sound. The ayin and the sadi, once again, the ayin has a hard, rough breathing sign, and the sadi is transliterated with an S with a dot underneath it. All right, going down to the next one, we have the mem and the samik. The mem, once again, is that's the ending mem with the boxed off, and the samik is, look how close. The only difference is in the bottom right-hand corner where the samik is curved just slightly, kind of shaved off a little bit, whereas the ending mem is more square. And then finally we have the vav and the zayin. The vav is very similar to the zayin. The only difference is that the zayin does kind of extend out a little bit beyond that. And once again, in the printed Hebrew Bibles, they do a little bit better job of distinguishing between the zayin and the noon. Or excuse me, the vav. All right, also going down to the next part, it says write the Hebrew for the following transliterated letters. All right, now this is something that you can just look at in your textbook to see what we're talking about, but we'll go to the chalkboard and work on these letters together. All right, write the Hebrew for the following transliterated letters. All right, we have the English word D. All right, in Hebrew, what would that be? Well, that would be the dalet, like that. Next, the mem, the M would be the Hebrew mem. All right, now learn to write both of the Hebrew letters. The mem looks like that, but if it ends a word, then it looks like a box, like that. All right, that corresponds to the English letter M. All right, then they say, how about the T? All right, the T, like that, would take the Hebrew letter Tav. Tav, like that. K, the K takes the Kaf, with or without the dagesh. We're still going to go with a K on that particular letter. The base, we know, has the B sound with the dagesh in it. All right, let's go on to the next one down. They say, what do you have in Hebrew that corresponds to the English V? Well, this would be two letters, the Vav, or it could be the base without the dagesh. Without the dagesh, it would be a V sound. All right, the rough breathing, that's our ayin. And then the next one down is the smooth breathing. That's the aleph. And then it says, how about the hard H sound? Remember, the transliteration is an H with a dot underneath it. That would be our Hebrew word heth. Remember, that's connected up there on the top left corner. Heth, pronounced cha, like that. And then P, the regular P sound, is going to be the pay with the dagesh. And once again, this does have an ending form that extends below the line like that. All right, you can complete those on the right-hand side yourself. That's an example of what we're looking at here on these transliterated letters. All right, then it says transliterate the following into English equivalents. We're at the bottom of page 22 on number or letter C there. All right, when we look at this, let's just follow along looking at your screen, and we'll transliterate these in the English equivalents. All right, starting at the top right, we have a mem and a hey, so that would be an M and an H. And then the next word, you have a teth, a base, and a Zion. All right, so that would mean that we have a T with a dot underneath it, a V, and then the S with the dot underneath it. And then the next word, the third word going from right to left, we have an aleph, a hey, a lamed, a yod, and an ending kaf. All right, so the aleph would take a smooth breathing. The hey would take an H sound. The lamed, of course, would be an L. And then the yod would be a Y. And then the kaf would be a definite K sound. And then the last word, the fourth word on the top line, we have a yod, an ayin, a kof, and a bet. All right, this would be transliterated, the yod would be a Y, the ayin would be a rough breathing, the kof would be a Q, and then the bet would be a V sound. By the way, that particular word is pronounced Yaakov and is the name for Jacob in Hebrew. So that's what Jacob's name looks like in Hebrew. All right, let's do line number 2. All right, we start out with the mem. Then we have the sheen. Notice that it doesn't have a dot, and so they're wanting us to understand that normally we would look for a dot there to see which arm it goes on. Then you have a kaf and a nun, a vav, tav, yod, and then the ending kaf. All right, now let's look at that word. First word, second line. Mem, that's an M sound. The sheen, that'd be an SH if it was on, the dot was on the right arm, and it'd be an S sound if it was on the left. The kaf is K. The nun is a N. The vav is a V. The tav is a definite T sound. And then we have another yod. And then the last letter of that word is the ending kaf. All right, let's go to the next word. Second word, second line. This has a yod, and then a sheen, and then a resh, and then an aleph, and then a lamed. All right, this would be, the yod would have a Y sound. The sheen would have a SH or an S, depending on where the dot would go. The resh would have a definite R sound. The aleph would have a smooth breathing. And then the lamed, an L sound. This, by the way, is the Hebrew word Israel. Yisrael would be the way that would be pronounced. All right, we'll do another line together here. The third line down, beginning on the right hand, going to the left, we have an aleph, a sheen, a resh, and a yod. All right, the aleph would take what? Take a smooth breathing mark. The sheen would take an S. The resh would take an R. and the yod would take a y. The next word, you have a hey, an aleph, a yod, and a sheen. All right, in your mind, think about what these would be taking. The hey would take an H. The aleph would take a smooth breathing. The yod would take a Y. And the sheen would take an S or an SH, of course, depending on which arm the little dot is on. Once again, which is the S? The sheen with the dot on the left side. The SH is the sheen with the dot on the right side. All right, the next word, the third one, is aleph, sheen, resh. Aleph would be a smooth breathing. Sheen would be either an S or an SH. Resh is a definite R. All right, the next one is the lamed and the aleph. This is, a lamed would be a definite L, and the aleph a smooth breathing. Then you have the next word, the third one from the end. You have a hey, a lamed, and a kaf. Once again, the hey would be an H, the lamed would be an L, and then the ending kaf would be or take a definite K. Second to the end, you have a bet, an ayin, a sadi, and a tav. This would be a V, a rough breathing mark. Sadi would take an S, a hard S with a dot underneath it. And then the tav would be T. And then the last one would be a resh, sheen, ayin, yod, mem. All right, by looking at this, the first one, the resh would take an R. The sheen would take an S or an SH. The ayin would take a rough breathing. The yod would take a Y. And the mem, which is the final mem right there, would take a definite am sound. All right, that's enough of that. You still have 4 more of those to do on your own, but you can work on those and begin understanding and looking at these Hebrew letters and seeing the difference between those two. All right, once again, before we proceed on to the next lesson, make sure that you stop the tape and you take the time and you work on these various exercises so that you're very comfortable with identifying and recognizing these various letters, and then we'll proceed on with the next lesson.